Well, it's great to be with you, and what a great story, Torbjörn. It's wonderful to hear stories of Jesus touching people. I've been coming over here, I think the first time in the Nordics was 27 years ago, before some of you were born, and others of you were, as I look out, maybe 50 years old back then. No, I'm just teasing. But we were planting a church in St. Petersburg and had an opportunity to stop on the way in Stockholm and Oslo and got to meet some of the leaders back then. And a few of you are still leading. Ted, I think we met the first time back then. And it was, great. And then I've been invited to this conference with a dear friend, David Parker, who sends his love to you. Some of you may know David, but we've been over 4 or 5 times for that. And the summer camp also, which, by the way, if you haven't signed up, you need to. And the summer camp's just a wonderful experience. And you guys do it better than any other vineyard in the world. So you do. It is really, really great. So I love that. I love smoked fish. So if you'd like to bring me a piece, no. But we're in the, and my wife loves IKEA. So there we go. So Vineyard Columbus is an incredibly diverse church. If you came in on a weekend service, you really would feel like you were walking into the United Nations. We have people from over 125 countries attending the church. So it's about 2/3 of the United Nations. It's about 50% white, European background, and 50% the whole world. From lots of Muslim background believers have come to the Lord at the church, and so we have folks from across North Africa. We have an Iranian small group, a small group of Arabic-speaking folk from the Middle East, French-speaking group from West Africa, a very large Swahili-speaking East African fellowship, Vietnamese fellowship in the church, Hungarian fellowship in the church. Who would have thought? That's the one that seems to me to be the oddest. I just like, really? We have a Hungarian-speaking fellowship in our church. We have a group from Indonesia, and we have a Spanish-language congregation that is our fastest-growing congregation. So it's a very diverse place. It's really a wonderful place. For those of you who are not accustomed to hearing from Americans, let me just dispel a few myths before I begin. Not every Christian American supports Donald Trump, okay? So in case you're wondering, all right, not every American owns guns or assault rifles. Not every American is wildly obese. Not every American hates the environment. Not every American is anti-science, anti-thinking. What other stereotypes? We love the poor, we love immigrants. So if you will allow me to get outside of your stereotypical box, I will let you get outside of the box that we Americans put you in, that you're fabulously wealthy, and you live in impossibly small spaces on top of one another, where everything is crammed into like IKEA showroom kinds of nooks and crannies, and you're all hedonists running around naked. So if you'll let me out of your box, I will let you out of my box, okay? And we can just be brothers and sisters in Jesus this weekend. Will that be okay? All right. So there we go. So I asked my staff to put together a list of excuses people have given them for why they're not involved in ministry. And in one day, they sent me 167 excuses that they had heard from people. I mean, lists and lists. I just want to read to you, maybe for some of you who are leaders. I know not everyone here is leading in the church. Many of you are. Some of you are paid. Many of you are unpaid. And some of you are just starting off, or somebody dragged you here for some reason and promised that you'd have dinner after. But here are some of the excuses why people can't serve in our church. It's too cold outside. These are real. I don't feel like it. I don't come from a long line of Christians at Vineyard Columbus. I don't have time now because I'm married. I don't have time now because I'm expecting a baby. I don't have time now because my child is in high school. I don't have time because I have small kids. I don't have time because I just got married and I need to think about my wife first. I don't have time because our kids have so many sports. I don't have time because the Buckeyes are playing. That, for those of you unfamiliar with American sports, the Ohio State football team is the best football team in America, so you can just... It really is. I don't have time now because I just bought a dog. I can't serve in your church because I don't speak in tongues, which is a requirement for us. I can't because it might snow. I thought we were going to cancel because it was raining. One person was more honest. They said, I don't want to because I'm lazy. Once I work and do what I want to do, I just don't want to go back outside. And then, of course, we heard, I'm too young, I'm too old, I'm divorced, I'm single. And tonight what I want to do is just look at one of the most famous men in the Bible who was a master excuse maker regarding why it is that he couldn't do what God was asking him to do. And maybe some of you will say, that sounds uncomfortably close to my own life. His name was Moses. And when Moses was called by God to tell Pharaoh, go down and let my people go, Moses had a lot of excuses why he was absolutely the wrong choice, and God needed to choose someone else. There's a really famous journalist in America. He's a man by the name of David Brooks, and he writes a column in a newspaper. Maybe you've heard of the New York Times. Some of you, yeah? Maybe you've heard of New York. Yeah? You do geography here? Yeah? Okay. Anyway, it's a newspaper in a city called New York in a country called the United States. And so he mentioned that at university graduations, at least in the United States these days, they always have what we call a commencement speaker. Somebody speaks to the graduates. And the typical themes that these commencement speakers speak on are they urge the graduates to follow their dreams, to not conform to anyone else's expectations, but to follow your heart, follow your passions, march to the beat of your own drummer, that you're the creator of your own future. And the assumption is that the deep answers to life are found inside yourself. And so if you can just get in touch with yourself, then you'll have wisdom for living. Is there any commonality, by the way, here? Yeah? Look inside, and that's where you'll find the truth. So according to these commencement speakers, what graduates need to do is to ask the question, what do I want from life? What do I want from life? And then go after that. What are my goals? What are my dreams? And then put a plan together to ruthlessly pursue your own goals. Now, the Bible presents us with a radically different picture of the good life. And the Bible tells us that you don't look inside yourself in order to figure out, well, what is it that I want? What are my dreams? What are my passions? Instead, the Bible says the good life is a response to something outside of us. It's a response to calling. It's a response to calling. And by the way, if it's at all helpful, I do have notes that you can kind of track along on your phone. And we always hand out notes, but you guys are so green here that you don't like to use paper at all, right? So you do have some papers lying around. You can even use the back if you want, or no. So the Bible says that the good life is found by calling, and it describes, first of all, that we are called by God, every one of us. So let me read to you from the book of Exodus, if you want to follow along on your phone. Exodus chapter 3, here's what we read. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see the strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, what do we mean by calling, and how is it different than just looking inside yourself to figure out what you want to do and what your goals are? A calling, especially a calling from God, is not an invitation. A calling is not an invitation to dialogue with God. It's not a multiple choice exam. God is not presenting us with a set of options. God is not asking by calling what our opinion is. He's not inviting us to dialogue and ask, what are your thoughts? I want to move, I really want to hear from you before I move forward with my plan for your life. If you wanted to have a substitute word for calling, it would be summons. Do you know what a summons is? Do you use that for courts? In a court in America, when a criminal defendant has to appear before the court, they issue a summons for that person to show up. And if they don't show up, there is a penalty. And so a calling is like a summons by our judge, and in this case, the one who is our Father, the one who loves us and who created us, and he is commanding us to first of all appear before him. Now, God says, here's what I made you for. You don't have to search around for that inside. You don't have to come up with your own plan for your life, or gosh, how do I live a meaningful life or a good life? We don't have to create our own destinies. God has a destiny for each one of you. He does. And the good life is discovering what His destiny, His plan is, and then walking that out, living into that, and believing that His plan for your life is really a good plan, that God hasn't missed anything. It's not that I've got to come up with something better and figure all of this out. That's not what we're designed to do. We're designed to respond to the Creator who made us for a purpose. And God issues summons. He calls us to Himself. Now, the fact is that all of us have multiple callings on our lives. We have multiple callings. It's not just one thing. I am called to be a father. I'm called to be a husband. I am now a grandfather. I'm called to be a pastor. I'm called to be a friend. I'm called to be a citizen. I'm called to be a neighbor, and so on. And many of you have multiple callings. But whether we're talking about our particular job, whether we're talking about our ministry, whether we're talking about our relationships, none of these things are big enough to provide us with ultimate meaning in life. And the problem that so many folks have in terms of a restlessness inside and a feeling like, wow, this life is not what I hoped it would be. The problem is that we reach into all of these created things, these secondary callings, for our ultimate satisfaction. We try to find satisfaction even in ministry because we think, well, at least that's Christian, and so I'll find real satisfaction in worship leading or in teaching or in serving kids, and all of those things are good, but they're just not ultimate. And so often our secondary callings swallow up our primary calling. Our primary calling is not to do something. Our primary calling is to relate to someone. Let me just say that again. Our primary calling is not to do something. God is not, first of all, inviting you to do anything. He is, first of all, inviting you into relationship with Himself. All ministry flows from intimacy. It does. It flows from a relationship with God. And so I want to talk for a moment about our first calling, which is a calling to God. You know, the problem again of restlessness in our life is that most of us try to find in our secondary callings what we can only find in our primary calling, and that is in our relationship with God. We are made for God. And it doesn't matter how much you work on your marriage, or how successful your business is, or how much money you make, how great your home is, or how you've kept your New Year's resolutions. Do you do that, by the way? Is that a custom here as well? To make a resolution and then break it the next day? Is that that's the American tradition, right? We stay on a diet for most of January 1st. And, I'm going to go to the gym, and, we get started, and then it gets cold, and it might snow, and so God calls Moses. This is a paradigm, it's a model. God calls Moses first to an encounter with Himself in the burning bush. And this pattern of being called first to God and then secondly to a task is found everywhere in the Bible. This is the pattern of God. He always calls a woman or a man first to Himself. And after they encounter Him, then He calls them to do something. And so, for example, with Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet Isaiah has an encounter with God in the temple. And he sees God, and only after he sees God and he sees heavenly worship do we read these words. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." But the first thing that happens is not that Isaiah says, "Send me." The first thing is he meets with God. The same thing is true in the New Testament. We read in Mark chapter 3 that Jesus appointed 12 that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach. We're first called to a relationship with Jesus, that we might be with him. You know, I read a survey not too long ago that said in the United States they did a survey of churches, about 5,000 churches. And they were talking about, you know, the kinds of folks who go to church, and they were drawing these concentric circles, people who are just on the fringe of the church, and then a little more connected, and then finally to the core. And they said of the core of churches, only 7% of people in the core were meeting with God daily in his word and in prayer. Only 7 out of 100 of the core. That's our first calling, to just be with God. We see this order in Jesus' calling of the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 22. When Paul was on his way to Damascus, let me read this to you. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" I asked. "I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting," he replied. My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. "What shall I do, Lord?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go to Damascus. There you'll be told all that you have been assigned to do." The first question, Paul says, is, "Who are you?" And the second question is, "What do you want me to do?" We almost always reverse the questions. The preoccupying question for most people is, what does God want me to do with my life? What does God want me to do with my future? What college does God want me to go to? Who should I marry? You know, should I have kids now? Where should I work? What city should I live in? Should I take this job promotion or not? You know, on and on. We're constantly asking the questions, "God, what do you want me to do?" And the first question, the prior question upon which those questions are built is, "Who are you, Lord?" And until I get that question down, "Who are you, Lord?" and who are you going to be for me? You know, in difficult times, in trials, in unexpected sadness and disappointments, who are you, Lord? I won't be able to successfully navigate these secondary questions. I need to know, who are you and who will you be for me? And it's not that the secondary questions are unimportant. They're terribly important. They're just not the foundation. So let me just ask a question before I move on, and that is, do you personally regularly find yourself turning your face to God just to be with God? Just to get to know who the Lord will be for you, not what you've been told, not secondhand, not what the pastor says God is like, or something you've heard from your parents or is out there in the church atmosphere. I mean, who is God for you really? As we would say in America, when the chips are down, when you're under pressure, when things are not working the way you hope they would work, who is God for you? Do you turn your face to him? Because our first call is a call to God. And how do we experience that first calling, a call to God, a call to intimacy? I want to read to you again from Exodus 3, verses 2 to 4. Here's what we read. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. There's an old English version of the Bible called the King James Version. I don't know if you've heard of the King James Version. But it translates verse 3 this way. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. And I think in those words we find a key for getting to know God better. We have to turn aside to encounter God. And most of us have these grooved out paths in life. You know, we're busy, we've got our heads down, and we're just doing what we're doing. And it could be good things, and it could even be ministry. But we're not encountering God. And so in order to encounter God, you've got to turn aside. You've got to turn your head. And what that means is we need to make space for God. We have to make room for God. Because we live in an incredibly busy time in terms of this period of history. It's extraordinarily packed. I saw a video a few years ago. It was called 40 Million Minutes. 40 million minutes. And here's what the video said. And it says, the average person lives 77 years. Here in the Nordic countries, what is it? 87, something like that. 107. But 77 years equates to 28,000 days, 670,000 hours, or 40 million minutes. The average person spends 24 minutes a day getting dressed. Some of you husbands would say, I wish that. 24 minutes a day getting dressed, that equals 13 hours a month, 7 days a year, or 1 year in a lifetime just getting dressed. The average person spends 40 minutes a day on the phone. That factors out to 20 hours a month, 10 days a year, or 2 years in a lifetime. The average person spends an hour a day in the bathroom. That amounts to 30 hours a month, 15 days a year, or 3 years in a lifetime. The average person spends 3 hours a day watching television. That's 90 hours a month, 45 days a year, or 9 years in a lifetime. The average Christian spends less than 10 minutes a day in prayer. That equates to less than 6 hours a month, 3 days a year, or 7 months in a lifetime. And the video ends with this statement: you do the math. And so, since this video was made, it was made about 8 years ago, the problem has gotten much worse with social media, and Facebook and YouTube and all the other ways that we engage technology that just increasingly encroaches on our time. And so if we're going to fulfill our primary calling, which is a calling to God, we've got to turn aside. You have to ruthlessly say, you know what? I want to know God for myself. In order for me to personally know God for myself, nobody else can do that for me. You have a choice. Nobody can do this for you. They can encourage you, they can motivate you, but they can't do it for you. You've got to ruthlessly say, I will set aside time to be with God. And for me, I do that in the morning. That works for me. For some of you, it might work in the evening, whatever the rhythm of your life is. But it's just, I've got to be really ruthless and say, the first thing I'm going to do in the morning after I make coffee is I'm going to sit down with God's Word, and I'm going to turn aside, and I'm going to just spend time with God. And on nice days, I go out for a walk, and I just walk and talk with God and build my friendship with Him. So, we're called to God. And what a great tragedy to come to the end of our lives, and we've, succeeded in a lot of things, and we say, I have this one regret, that I don't know God very well. And now here I am, and I'm older, and God's not very real to me. I believe about Him. I've gone through the motions, but I just don't know him very well. That does not have to be the case. You can have as much of God as you want, every one of us. There's no amount that God has said, well, Fleming can have a lot of God, but you can't. All of us can have as much of God as we want. So our first call is to God, to relate to God, to know God, to be intimate with God. And the second call is a call to a task. It's a call to a task. God calls first to himself and then to a task. And like all of us, Moses makes excuses why he can't do what God tells him to do. And so if you read through Exodus 3 and 4, there are actually 5 excuses Moses makes. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to tick off 4 of them, okay? So 4 excuses Moses makes, and maybe some of you will know someone who has made this excuse, all right? So you might be sitting near someone or in your section, and you can look over and elbow them and say, that's really you. I'm glad I've never made this excuse, but I know you have. And so the first excuse Moses makes is, I am not qualified. I'm not qualified. Verse 11. Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? God, you've got this wrong. You don't understand. I'm not able to do what you want me to do. Maybe he thought back on his past failure 40 years before, and look, I've already failed at this, so there's no way that you would want me to do this again because the first time I did it, it just blew up on me. And so, I tried. It didn't work. Maybe he thought about his age. He was 80 years old when God called him. Maybe he thought the task is too great. This is just too big. And somebody like me can't accomplish this size task. When pastors try to speak in the name of the Lord and invite people into various tasks, we hear the same kind of thing. I'm just not qualified to do what you're asking me to do. Often a person will do what Moses did, and that is look at themselves. And they'll say, well, you don't understand. I'm damaged goods. The number one excuse in America why people don't serve in ministry is, I don't have the time. That's the number one excuse. The number 2 excuse over and over again is, there's something about me that is defective. I am damaged goods. Do you use that term, by the way? Do you understand what that means? There's something, I've been through a divorce, or, I had this addiction, or if you knew my history, I've got issues, I've got problems, I'm not qualified. One of the blessings of reading through the Bible, I try to read through the Bible most years at least once. I do. It just helps me to just read through the Bible. And one of the blessings of reading through the Bible is you discover that the people God calls, they're all damaged goods. Right from the get-go, it is really encouraging. Because we think the people in the Bible were like amazing heroes. They're like superheroes. They're like Black Panther or, and they're not. They're just ordinary people. Abraham, he lies. He's a coward. He shrinks back when he needs to be courageous. His grandson Jacob was a master liar and deceiver and constantly cut corners. But God used Abraham. God used Jacob, changed his name to Israel. Rahab, what was her profession? For those of you who don't know, God used Rahab and put her in his hall of fame of faith, and she was a prostitute. Some people had dropped out of ministry. Some people had walked away. Some people had run away, like Jonah, John Mark in the New Testament. But God used them, and God will use you. And there's no one who's so damaged that if we turn our face to God, that God wouldn't use us in all of our inadequacy. The answer to you and me not being qualified is not to try to make ourselves qualified. That's not the answer. The answer to our inadequacy is not to try to convince yourself that you really are adequate, you really are up to the task. God gives this answer to Moses in Exodus 3:12. God says, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you. It is I who have sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you'll worship God on this mountain. And if you had a Bible, and if it was open, and if you had a pen and you actually could underline, that phrase, I will be with you, is one of the most encouraging phrases in the Bible in dealing with our own inadequacies, because that's what the Lord says over and over in Scripture when people say, I can't do this. God doesn't say, oh, you can, you just need to believe in yourself more. The Lord doesn't say that. You never see God tell people, you know what, the problem is you have too low self-esteem. And if you just could, boost your own self-esteem, you would be doing really great. God never does that. He points people away from themselves and he says, look at me. Don't look at yourself, look at me, and I will be with you. In the days of the prophet Haggai, the people were tasked with rebuilding the temple. The temple had been destroyed, and it was destroyed for decades, and it was just rubble. And they're looking at this pile of stones, and they just go, we can't do it. We cannot rebuild this temple. And God sends the prophet Haggai with one simple word to the people. Really simple. And you can read the book. It's one sentence. I will be with you. And then they start to rebuild. You don't need to know a lot as long as you know the Lord. And Jesus tells us the same thing, doesn't he? He gives us a great commission. He says, go out in all the world and do what? Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you always to the end of the age. All of these alls, we disciple all nations and teach them to do all that I told you guys to do. And we go like, if you have any sense of like how insane that commission is. Like I'm supposed to disciple, like I look around my country and what percentage of people in the Nordic countries are, first of all, just atheists? Radical secularists into the New Age, Muslim immigrants, Jewish, agnostics, and on and on. You look at folks and you go like, how in the world are we going to plant churches and fulfill this great commission? Like, how are we going to do it? And not just be kidding ourselves about this. Like, how do we actually do this? And Jesus says, okay, let me give you the secret. I will be with you, even to the close of the age. And that's what God says to me. He doesn't say, hey, Vineyard, you got to just believe in yourself. You guys are amazing. You're like the most amazing church movement like in history. You're like bigger than Roman Catholics. You're like so much larger. And you're going to be so much better organized than Catholics. No. You're going to be smarter than the Reformed Church. You're going to have better theologians. You're going to move in more power than, and just tick off the box. He doesn't say that. The promise is, I will be with you. It's really simple and incredibly profound. So, I'm not qualified. That's excuse number one. Excuse number two, I don't have all the answers. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me. And they ask me, what's his name? What should I say? I can't share my faith with my Muslim neighbor, because what if they start asking me questions about like the Trinity? And I barely understand it. And then I'm going to explain it to this Muslim person, and they start saying, well, what do you mean Jesus is the Son of God? And does that mean that God had sex? And you know, why would God allow his son to die on a cross? And what about the virgin birth? And do you believe this? And you know, and I don't have all the answers, so I can't speak. So what do you do? Like, I mean, that freezes a lot of people from sharing their faith. They're going to ask me something that I don't know the answer to. They're going to ask me about like why their baby died. And I don't have an answer for suffering. Like, if God is good, why did my baby die? Or you know, any one of 1,000 questions that you struggle with. And someone told me when I first came to Christ that one of the most helpful answers you could give to somebody like who asks you a really hard question, it's just 3 words. I don't know. I don't know. But we don't stop there. But if you're really interested, I think I know people who do know. And I will look into this. If you're serious about that question, I will look into this and I'll get back to you. Are you really interested in finding out an answer, or is this just something that you're trying to push me away with? Because some people just raise all kinds of objections and they're not really serious. And so God says to Moses, you don't have to know everything. You don't. You don't have to know everything. God said to Moses, here's the answer to you not knowing everything. I am who I am. This is what you were to say to Israel, the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Now, there have been doctoral dissertations written on the meaning of that phrase, I am who I am. And lengthy theologies about what does that mean, I am who I am. Some of you know that that's a translation of God's Hebrew name, which is Yahweh. Yahweh. I am who I am. And it comes from a Hebrew verb, hayah, which means to be. So what is God saying when he says, I am who I am? Or, well, I think what God is saying in this, and there's lots of theories, but the one that I kind of latched onto over the years is, I am eternally active and I will always be present for you. When God is saying, I am who I am, he's saying, I am eternally present. I am always active. There's no place where I am not. If you're in the hospital, I am there and present for you. If you're in the workplace, I am there and I am present for you. If you're going through the death of a parent or the loss of a loved one or an illness, I am there. I am there, in school, and I am there in your ministry. I'm there in your work, in your church plant, and there when you're trying to gather a group, I am there. I'm always working. I never stop. God is not the one who started the world, wound it up, and let it go and withdrew. God is eternally present. He's there in your family no matter what you're going through. He's there if you move to another city. He's there if you move to another country. He's there listening to our prayers. He's constantly loving our kids, and he hears our prayers for our children. He's constantly repairing things. He's constantly redeeming. He's constantly refreshing. So here's the third excuse. I'm not gifted enough. Exodus 4:10. Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor in the present. Since you have spoken to your servant, I'm slow of speech and tongue. We often think, well, at least if I had the abilities of that person, then I would do it. But I don't have those abilities, so I can't do it. And God says, who gave human beings their mouth? Who made them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Go and I'll help you to speak. Again, God never points to the person and says, you're just getting down on yourself, Moses. You really are a good speaker. Come on. Stop beating yourself up. He never does that with us. That's what we do with each other, and we call that encouragement. You're amazing. You're incredible. And that's okay. That's all right. But that ultimately, we know inside, I'm not so incredible. And really, if you really, really knew me, you'd know that there were just some massive holes. So the foundation for our lives cannot be that I will look inside myself and find something to build on. It's got to be I need someone bigger than me, more adequate than me. I've got to build my life on God, because everything else is going to wash away, and we're going to have so much pressure put on us, and it's just going to, at some point we will give way. And so God says, look at me. Well, here's the fourth excuse. I don't want to. Moses said, pardon your servant, please send someone else. I don't want to do it. I know what you want, and I don't want to do it. So I just want to close by just telling you the story of my own calling, and we'll have an opportunity to minister, okay? So I was not trained to be a pastor. I was trained to be a lawyer in America, and went to law school and got out and got a job teaching law at a university in the city where I am right now, which is Columbus, Ohio. And my career just took off. And we were making a lot of money, and I had written a textbook, and I was about to be tenured in the university. I don't know if you guys have a system like what we have, but once you achieve tenure in American universities, you have a lifetime appointment. So you can't be fired unless, like, if you kill a student, they would say, you really, we don't want you to do that again. But, I mean, it's a lifetime appointment. It's really difficult to get rid of tenured professors. And so I was up for tenure. And things were going really well, but I had this gnawing inside about ministering to God's people. And we were part of a little church, and I was bivocational. And so I would preach on Sunday, but and care for people, and then work at the university, and very much like Torbjorn, we were seeing wonderful things at the university. I was doing deliverances in my office at the university. You may not realize, but there's a lot of demons at universities, and they live inside of some of the professors. And so, I'm not kidding. You think like, oh, that's really, I really was praying for deliverance in my office. So in any case, I was on a prayer ministry trip. John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard movement, some of you had the privilege many years ago of knowing John. He's gone to be with the Lord 20 years ago now, but he was doing conferences all over the world, and I was on one of his prayer ministry teams back then. And I had a friend say, hey, Rich, what are you going to do about this pastor thing? Are you ever going to leave your job and go to work for the Lord full time in terms of paid ministry? I think everybody's a minister, but are you going to break off from business and just go for it? And I said, I don't know. I have prayed about this 1,000 times, and I just am stuck. I just don't know. I haven't heard the voice of God. So he said, ask the Lord for a sign. Ask the Lord for a sign. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. It was Monday night, and I said, God, speak to me before Wednesday night. I'm going to, back then we didn't have cell phones. We used to shout in like a ram's horn. And then it would go out. It was a little wire and, really? No, it was really a tin can, and you'd hold it to your ear. No, you had to call, like payphone, and some of you have never heard of that, but you had to call, and so I scheduled a phone call with my wife on Wednesday night, and so I said, Lord, however you want to speak, just speak. However you want to do it, just speak. And Tuesday, nothing happened. Wednesday, nothing. Wednesday evening, got to the meeting, and John Wimber got up and he said, I was going to talk about healing tonight, but I feel like the Lord's calling me to speak about the pearl of great price. And he started his talk this way. Some of you are asking the Lord whether God is calling you into full-time ministry. You'll know it's God when it's the last hour. When you have no more time, then you'll know it's God. I was going to call my wife right after, and I thought, wow, this is incredible. And over the course of the night, he mentioned 7 specific things that, like, you're going to get to this point in your career, and you're going to be making money, and blah, blah, blah. And then God's going to say, now it's time for you to go. You've got to go. And I thought, wow, that's pretty incredible. And so there were some other prophetic words, and then on Friday morning, my roommate got up and he said, Rich, I had a dream about you last night. And I said, really, what was the dream? And he said, well, in the dream, you were combing this woman's hair and braiding it and putting different things in her hair. And I said, oh, yes, that's it. God is calling me to be a beautician, and because I'm so good at that. And he said, no, it was the Lord. You're going to see it's the Lord. And so I said, right, yeah, that was the Lord. Well, that evening, people deliver these dreams, and, it's, really? I don't know what that means, Well, that evening, right before worship, a woman got up, and she said, I have a prophetic word for some of you men. The Lord is calling some of you men to prepare the hair of the bride of Christ. And she described how some of the men are going to be combing the hair and braiding it and getting the bride ready for her groom. I just bent over and began to cry. I said, oh, Lord, to prepare your church? Wow. So I went home and I told the leaders of our fellowship what had happened, and they said, Rich, we've known for years you were supposed to be our pastor. We were waiting for you to, step up and do it already. And so I talked with my wife, Marlene, and Marlene said, well, time out here. You had all these wonderful experiences in England. I haven't had any of those experiences. And we've spent so many years investing in your career, and now, you're making all of this money, and we were really doing well, and you're going to go to work for this small church. My salary was going to be cut more than in half, and in the United States, we don't have state-supported health benefits. So I was going to get no health care, and the university had health care. I had a retirement plan, and on and on and on. And football tickets to the best college football program in America. And so she said, I need to hear from God. And I said, that's right. So we called off the public meeting and just waited on the Lord. And over the course of the month, I just began thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know. I don't know if that really was God. And I'm starting to weigh it. And it's like getting very, very expensive. And part of it is, it doesn't matter how clearly God speaks to you. It really doesn't. You always have to add faith to it. It's never so certain that, you can't doubt. You can doubt. And so in any case, I was at a prayer meeting one evening, and I was just praying in my heart with some of the other leaders in the church, and I said, oh God, if that really was you in England, would you speak to me another time? And I was just praying that in my heart to God, and this guy came out with a prophetic word, and he said, I've spoken to you once, yes, twice, says the Lord. if you will not listen to me, I won't speak to you a third time. And then he went like this. Is that for anybody? And I said, well, let me just tell you what I was praying like a second before in my heart. And I went home and told Marlene, and she was so convicted. She said, if we don't do this, let's go out tonight and get hit by a train. And I said, I don't want to get hit by a train. But, once you know what God has for you, you can't pretend that you could just go back to being a nice person. And God is calling. So I want to close with this. There's a verse from the book of Hebrews. And before Moses was able to say yes to God, he had to say no to the world and some of its attraction. And here's what we read. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to the reward. Moses refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated. He regarded disgrace for Christ as being of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. There comes a point in every man or woman's life who is sincere about Jesus that you have a choice. There's just two roads. There really are. And you have a choice. If I say yes to what God is calling me to, I have to say no to something that's really attractive. And it's impossible to try to blend them together. You can't say, well, I really just want to walk on both paths, Lord. I want to do what you're telling me to do, but I don't want to say no to all of this. And we always try to find some ways to compromise it out. And maybe I can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And before you're clear about what God is saying to you, yeah, you can do that. But if the Lord speaks, then the only choice is really to obey or to go out and get hit by a train. So we're faced with a choice. And I do wonder this evening as I was preparing this message if the Lord might not be saying to some of you that there are some things that you are going to have to choose to say no to, and some really attractive things. And it may be, the esteem of parents or the esteem of colleagues or professional advancement. It may be a job offer or, in my case, I was bivocational and I had to say no. And God was saying that. And I just wonder for some of you if the Lord is not saying, it's time for you to stop trying to pull these two roads together, whatever it is, and hold on to these two things and just go for it. And really go for it. And for some, you might have been spoken to for years, and for others, it might be a fresh thing or a fresh inclination. But I do wonder about God issuing callings, saying, here's what I have for you. So could we stand? And I did feel, as I prepared, that the Lord was inviting some of you, summoning, to use an American expression, summoning some of you to say no to some aspect of the world so you can more fully say yes to God and what God is saying to you. And I feel like I had a few other words, but if that is you, if the Lord has been drawing you into some calling, maybe you've been making excuses and fending him off in some way, or it's just a lot of inertia. Sometimes I've been doing something for such a long time that it's hard to imagine just breaking out of that orbit and being able to, really launch. But the Lord can do that. All it takes is an obedient heart just to say, okay, God, yes, I just want you. So if the Lord has been speaking to you about a call, if God has been speaking to you about saying no to some aspect of the world so you can say yes to his call, would you just step out from where you are and come up here and allow us just to invite God's Spirit to empower your obedience, and just to say, Lord, okay, He doesn't require great, it's not like I've got to make myself adequate or gear myself up or anything, and it's not all of you, but there are some of you. The Lord is saying, in order to say yes to the next thing that I've got for you, you've got to put this aside. So would you come? That applies to any of you? Say, that's me. Just make your way up. We'll just have an opportunity to pray. And I don't know what that other thing is. I mean, for some, it could be business. For others, it could be somebody's respect. It could be, a dream that you've had for a long time, that I would live this kind of life or have this kind of relationship or make this kind of impact. And God's saying, you've got to lay that dream down or that particular